Good afternoon. I'm Professor Susannah Heschel, and this is the second in my series of lectures about Jews and pandemics. I spoke earlier about the position of, or the association of Jews with plagues in antiquity and also in the Hebrew Bible. And now I want to turn to the situation in the medieval period. Michael Doles, a historian, has written that the massacre of the Jews during the Black Death of the 14th century was unprecedented in their extent and ferocity until the 20th century, by which, of course, he means the Nazi Holocaust. What were these attacks on Jews during the 14th century plague? Were they an exception to the general rule of Jews and Christians living in harmony, or a continuity of anti-Semitism? Were the attacks motivated by an overarching Western discourse of anti-Judaism, or by a particular configuration of political events of the moment? And was this a spontaneous mob violence or a violence directed from above? Who wanted the Jews dead? The German historian Alfred Haverkamp has written that the initiative and decisive impulse to attack Jews came from the gentry, the Junkers, and the patricians, or even the regional prince in these towns, sometimes even a bishop. And this seems to be the standard argument of most historians today. But what happened in the 14th century? Over 1,000 Jewish communities through the Rhineland, down into Spain and France, Switzerland, the Netherlands were attacked. Jews were taken, men, women, and children, locked into a synagogue, and the synagogue was set on fire. Jews were burned to death. Why? And here is an illustration. The traditional historical interpretation has been that the attacks on Jews were carried out by mobs of peasants who were resentful of Jews. They wanted the property. They were angry at owing debts to Jewish moneylenders. But that argument seems to have been exaggerated, and it's now come under some criticism by historians. But let's look at the traditional interpretation. The great late historian Amos Funkenstein and also the historian Jeremy Cohen, both from Israel. Jeremy Cohen, by the way, was a visiting professor at Dartmouth 2 years ago. Both have argued that there was a change in the anti-Jewish polemics of Christians in the period between the 12th and 14th century, specifically the rise of the new preaching orders of Franciscans and Dominicans in the 13th century, who discovered the existence of the Talmud. The Talmud is the major collection of works of Jewish law and theology compiled over a period of 500 years by rabbis living in Babylonia, which is today Iraq. This discovery of the Talmud meant a change in Christian thinking about Jews. Until then, Christians thought of Jews as people of the Bible, like Abraham and Moses. But now they discovered that the Jews weren't simply adherents of the Hebrew Bible, but they had another book that even superseded it, namely the Talmud. This also meant, they felt, an end to the need to take care of the Jews, to protect them, an end to the paradigm that had been established by St. Augustine, who had said that the fact that Jews are in a subservient status to Christians is proof of Christian superiority. So preserve the Jews, Augustine said, don't kill them. Preserve them as witnesses to the truth of Christianity. Now, that's one argument, the change in the understanding of Jews that developed in the 13th, 14th century. There's another argument by the great historian Carlo Ginzburg, who says that the first half of the 14th century saw the emergence of conspiracy theory, of an irrational mentality, of a demonization of Jews that led to the attacks in the mid-14th century, the pogroms against the Jews. More recently, the historian Samuel Cohn at the University of Glasgow, who's an expert on epidemics, has argued that the persecution of Jews in the 14th century didn't start with the poor, but rather with the wealthy. The attacks that took place during the Black Death were not part of a movement for social redress, he argues. It wasn't a class struggle against the elites. It wasn't the poor who owed money to Jewish moneylenders, for example. Rather, it wasn't the moneylenders at all, but doctors, women, students, cantors, and most often rabbis who were attacked. And it wasn't the poor who got the benefit of Jewish property once the Jews were killed, but rather the wealthy who took that Jewish property. David Nuremberg, the historian at the University of Chicago, in an important book called Communities of Violence, has argued, quote, "No textual evidence I know of indicating that Christians in the Crown accused religious minorities of spreading the plague through poison. That is, the arguments that we found in 1321 that the Jews had poisoned the wells was not revived during the Black Death. Rather, he argues, Jews were murdered for being Jews in a Christian society. Their murder was an effort at expiation and repentance, simply for tolerating Jews in the midst of a Christian world." Nuremberg also argues that violence can bind and sunder in the same motion, can bring people together as well as tear apart communities. What about the Jewish view of all that was happening? For Jews, the plague from the time of the Bible was understood as divine punishment for sin. Even one person who sins can bring a plague upon the entire society. Also, the massacres that occurred in the mid-14th century led to massive migrations of Jews. This is simply an illustration of plague in an ancient city done in 1652. But what happened during the plague itself? And what's interesting is to see that in some places, there were religious processions. In 1362, the plague reached Cyprus. And what happened? Christians held a procession to beg God's forgiveness and beg God to end the plague. They fasted on bread and water. Who joined the procession? Greeks, Armenians, Nestorians, Jacobites, Georgians, Nubians, Indians, Ethiopians, and many other Christians, along with many infidels, Turks, Saracens, and Jews. They burst into tears and walked with bare feet and great devotion in the Christian procession. In 1449, in Seville, another example of plague, Christians held penitential processions, and Jews did likewise. They held their own procession, holding a Torah scroll. Now, this is quite different from what had happened 100 years earlier with the flagellants, who had ripped apart communities, fueled hatred of Jews and conflict with church and state authorities. But there's something else too. Already in 1347, chroniclers of the Black Death reported that people who were sick were at times deserted by members of their own family who were supposed to be taking care of them. Mothers, uncles, brothers, wives walked out on their sick relatives and fled for their lives. The result of this, of being abandoned, and also the mob violence against Jews, was horrifying to Europeans. And in fact, subsequent outbreaks of plague did not include the same violence against Jews that we see in the mid-14th century. Here's another illustration. What do we see after this Black Death? Between 1350 and 1500, we see a decline in bloody violence against Jews and instead a shift to something else, expulsion of Jews in Europe. So following the Black Death, immediately after, actually what happened is the Jews in Spain gained prestigious governmental positions and the patronage of the crown. They did well right after. This, one historian argues, led to jealousy on the part of Christians, and it was a reason for the outbreak of persecutions of Jews in 1391 in Spain, persecutions that insisted the Jews have to convert to Christianity. And in fact, many Jews did convert. They came to be known as new Christians or conversos. In Florence, the government expelled some Jews in some communities more than once in the early 15th century. But what historians find is that it was the elites who were the ones to preach anti-Semitic ideas and pass laws expelling Jews, while the so-called rabble, the peasants and townsmen who were impoverished and who were also burdened by high taxation, that those people supported the local Jewish community and valued them, valued the Jews also as instruments of credit through money lending. Now, just one generation after the Black Death, in Germany, the Germanic-speaking territories, the population of Jews in cities stood at more than 100. But after the expulsion, after 1519, the expulsion of Jews from Regensburg, there were hardly any Jews left in the middle or large cities of that region. So what we see is that after the Black Death, the way Jews were removed from the urban landscape was not through mob violence and burning, but by legal means, by expulsion. In Italy, we see that at the end of the 15th century, commoners lived in harmony with Jews, granted them rights of citizenship, and honored their money lending, their credit operations. It was, in fact, patricians who were the first to be stirred by the anti-Semitic Franciscans who were preaching against the Jews and who condemned Jews, Jewish moneylenders, and finally expelled them. A Hebrew text that's a manuscript at the University of Warsaw Library that was written in 1485 says very straightforwardly, and there were no more persecutions in Ashkenaz, in that Germanic territory, after the Black Death. To this day, there were indeed many expulsions. What about Muslim areas? Numerically speaking, there were more Jews living under Islam than under Christianity through the course of history. Now, as you studied with Thucydides, the plague is viewed as a disaster that defies human reason, but it's also a permanent aspect of the human condition. It's a fate like floods and droughts and diseases. Muslims felt that way too. And during the course of a plague, when it would reach a Muslim area, there often were processions, and of course, an increase in personal piety with the recitation of verses of the Quran, of passages from the Hadith, prayers at graves, giving charity and food to the poor. But what we don't see are messianic movements, no sense that the plague was an apocalypse or the Jews have to suffer because of the plague. Here are a couple of examples. In Egypt, the Black Death led to blame on religious minorities, on women. Women, of course, were accused of not being pious enough or not being modest enough, of not, all people, not having sufficient religious devotion. That's why the plague came. But it was not a punishment from God on Muslims. And in fact, any Muslim who died of the plague was viewed as a martyr. In 1419, an intercessory procession was led for relief from the plague to plead to God. All ages, wealth, genders, and religions, including Jews, participated in that and in so many other religious processions. Now, just a word about something interesting that took place in the Ottoman Empire. Many Jews lived in Salonika, and Salonika was an important city. It was on the trade route and an important urban center, and it was full of Jews. Many Jews immigrated to Salonika after the expulsion from Spain in 1492 and Portugal in 1497. So the Jewish neighborhoods of Salonika were in fact pretty crowded. The major occupation of Jews in Salonika was textiles. And in fact, just about every Jewish home was also a weaving workshop. Now, the plague came to Salonika in the summer of 1568. And Jews had a contract to produce wool broadcloth for the Ottoman government. But when the plague arrived, everybody who could fled the city and went to the countryside. The result of this was the Jews were late in producing the broadcloth for the Ottoman government, and the government was mad about it. Now, there's one other factor. People didn't understand, and you study this in other classes, the cause of plague. And they weren't aware at the time that wool itself was a host of plague vectors, including the rat flea. So in fact, Jewish homes with their weaving workshops and the wool present actually could have been a center for the emergence of plague. But that wasn't known, and Jews were not blamed for the plague. But by fleeing to the countryside, they were late in producing the broadcloth to the government, and this raised some questions in Istanbul. Could the Jews plead that the plague was an act of God, and therefore the Jews should not have to pay a penalty, and in fact could postpone their taxation? This became a question following the 1568 plague epidemic. A legal opinion was issued in Istanbul about the permissibility of fleeing from a plague-stricken city. And in fact, it authorized, quote, exiting a plague-stricken city in search of a safer place and using caution and taking preventative measures against the plague. So the Jews were not, in fact, penalized for being late in turning in their broadcloth or in having to pay their taxes. This is an illustration of plague victims in Perugia, a 16th century image. What about Jewish responses to plague? That's the topic of my next lecture. I'm going to stop here and come back to ask, what did Jews do during a plague? How did they respond? What did they do religiously, in addition to having religious processions? So I'll see you in my next lecture.